On a Monday morning in June of 2001, in Dodge County, Nebraska, a man named Walter Price walked out to his cattle lot at 5:30 in the morning, the way he had walked out every morning for 43 years, and found his water pressure at zero. Not low, not reduced. Zero. The pipes that fed his livestock waterers were dry. The holding tank that supplied his farmstead was empty. The creek-fed intake system that his father had built in 1961 and that Walter had maintained and relied on for his entire farming life was producing nothing. Walter was 64 years old. He stood in the cattle lot in the early June light with 38 head of Angus cattle that would need water within the next few hours, and he understood immediately that something serious had happened upstream. He drove his truck north along the county road to the point where his intake system connected to the small tributary creek that crossed the corner of his property. What he found there was a concrete headwall, newly poured, with a steel gate set into it that was closed completely. The gate had a padlock on it. The padlock had a tag on it. The tag said, "Property of Agricor Development, LLC. Authorized personnel only." Walter looked at the headwall for a long time. It had not been there Friday evening when he'd driven past on his way back from the co-op in Fremont. Someone had poured concrete, set forms, installed a gate, and padlocked it over a weekend on a tributary that crossed through land Walter did not own, but that had been providing water to the Price farm since 1961. He drove back to the house and called his neighbor to the north, a man named Dale Ostergaard, who had sold his 480 acres to a company called Prairie Holdings the previous fall. Dale answered on the third ring, said he'd been expecting Walter's call, said he was sorry, said he didn't know they were going to move that fast. Walter asked what Prairie Holdings had to do with Agricor Development. Dale said they were the same company. Said Prairie Holdings was the land acquisition arm and Agricor Development was the construction arm. Said the company had been buying land in Dodge County for 18 months and was building what they were calling a regional grain processing and storage campus. Said the campus required significant water infrastructure and that the tributary creek was part of their water supply plan. Said their engineers had determined that Walter's intake system reduced the available flow to their facility below the level their permits required. Walter hung up the phone. He sat at the kitchen table where his father had sat and his grandfather before that, and thought about what he was going to do about 38 head of cattle that needed water in approximately 3 hours. Let me tell you about Walter Price before we go further, because the man matters as much as the situation, and you cannot understand one without understanding the other. Walter was the second generation of Prizes to farm in Dodge County. His father, Emil Preis, had come to Nebraska from Germany in 1931 at the age of 19, with nothing that could be counted in monetary terms and everything that mattered in terms of willingness to work. Emil had hired out as a farmhand for 8 years, saved every dollar he didn't spend on food and a place to sleep, and bought his first 160 acres in 1939 from a family that was leaving Nebraska for reasons that had become common in those years. Emil had built the farm methodically, the way men of his generation and background built things, with patience and without shortcuts. Adding acres when he could pay for them, and equipment when he could maintain it, and infrastructure when he understood exactly what he was building and why. He had run a beef cow operation alongside his row crops because he understood that diversification was not a financial strategy, but a survival strategy. That a farm with multiple income streams was a farm that could survive the year when one of those streams ran dry. In 1948, Emil Preis had dug a well. He had not dug it because he needed it urgently. His farmstead at that time was supplied by a surface water system drawing from the same tributary that Walter's intake would later use. The well was not a response to a crisis. It was a response to Emil's understanding of risk. The same understanding that had made him diversify his crops and his livestock, the same understanding that made him pay off equipment before buying more and keep a year's operating expenses in a savings account that he touched only when there was no other choice. Emil had hired a well driller from Fremont, a man named Schultz, who had been drilling wells in Dodge County since the 1920s and who knew the aquifer geology the way other men know their own farms. Schultz had drilled to 180 feet through the clay overburden and the sand and gravel layers above into the Platte River alluvial aquifer that underlies most of eastern Nebraska at depths that vary, but that in Dodge County were reliably accessible at 150 to 200 feet. The well had produced 35 gallons per minute on the test, which was more than Emil needed for his farmstead and his livestock, and which Schultz had told him would likely remain consistent for as long as anyone would need it, because the alluvial aquifer was recharged annually by the Platte River system and was essentially inexhaustible at agricultural use. Rates. Emil had paid $1,200 for the well in 1948. He had cased it with steel, capped it with a concrete pad, and installed a hand pump as backup to the electric submersible he'd put in at the same time. He had registered the well with the state of Nebraska, which required registration of all new wells drilled after 1945, and had received a well registration certificate from the Nebraska Department of Water Resources, confirming the well's location, depth, and permitted use. Emil had told Walter about the well when Walter was old enough to understand what he was being told. He had said, "The surface water can be interrupted. A dry year, a neighbor's dam, something upstream. Surface water is convenient, but it's not yours to count on completely. The well is yours. It goes into the ground we own, it draws from water that no neighbor can affect, and as long as the pump works and the casing holds, nobody can take it from you." Walter had listened. He had grown up on the farm and had worked alongside his father for 20 years before Emil died in 1979, and the operation passed to Walter entirely. He had maintained the well the way Emil had maintained everything, on a schedule, without waiting for things to fail before addressing them. He had replaced the submersible pump in 1983 when it began showing signs of wear. He had had the casing inspected in 1991 and found it sound. He had tested the water annually and kept the records in a folder in the filing cabinet in his office. He had not used the well as his primary water supply since the mid-1960s, when Emil had built the creek intake system that was more convenient for the expanded operation. The well had been there, maintained and tested and registered, drawing no attention and requiring no explanation, for 53 years. Walter sat at the kitchen table in June of 2001 and thought about Emil's well. Before we go any further, I want to say something directly. If you are watching this and you have ever been told that the old ways, the careful ways, the ways of the men and women who built things to last and kept records of what they built are no longer relevant, this story is for you. Stay with me. What Emil Preis did in 1948 was not complicated. It was not clever in any strategic sense. It was simply careful. And careful, as you are about to see, is sometimes the only thing standing between a family and losing everything. Subscribe if you haven't already. These farming stories deserve your full attention, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. Walter's first call after hanging up with Dale Ostergaard was to his veterinarian, a man named Dr. Carl Whitmore, who had been the large animal vet for that part of Dodge County for 20 years. Walter told him he had no water and 38 head of cattle and asked how long he had before it became a serious health issue. Doctor Whitmore said in June heat, cattle that size needed 15 to 20 gallons per head per day, and that significant stress would begin within 6 to 8 hours of deprivation. Walter had approximately 3 hours before the cattle had been without water for the overnight period, and things would start going wrong. His second call was to his son, Paul, who was 34 years old and worked in Fremont, but came to the farm most weekends and knew the operation well enough to be useful in an emergency. Walter told Paul to come out immediately and bring every water container he could find in his garage. His third call was to the well, not to a person, to the well itself, in the sense that Walter walked out to the concrete pad on the north side of the machine shed, pulled back the steel cap he kept locked over the casing, connected a hose to the hand pump outlet that Emil had installed in 1948 as backup to the electric system, and began pumping. The water came up on the four-stroke, clear, cold, 180 feet of lift through solid steel casing from an aquifer that the Platte River had been recharging since before anyone in Dodge County had been born. Walter pumped until the flow was steady, and then he connected the hose to a 500-gallon tank he'd pulled from the equipment shed and began filling it. Paul arrived 40 minutes later. Together they ran hoses from the well to temporary waterers in the cattle lot, filling tanks by hand and by bucket and by every container they had, keeping the cattle supplied while Walter thought through the larger problem of what Agricor Development had done and what he could do about it. He called a lawyer in Fremont that afternoon, not a farm law specialist because Dodge County didn't have one, but a general practice attorney named Ruth Hendricks, who had handled enough agricultural matters over her 25 years of practice in eastern Nebraska to know which questions to ask and which people to call when she needed expertise she didn't have herself. Ruth asked Walter to bring her everything he had related to his water rights. His water use permit for the creek intake system, his well registration certificate, his deed, his historical records of water use, anything that established what he had a right to and for how long. Walter brought the folder he kept in his filing cabinet. He brought the water use permit that Emil had obtained in 1961 when he built the intake system and that Walter had renewed on the required schedule ever since. He brought the well registration certificate from 1948, the original document that the state had sent Emil when the well was drilled, with the well's coordinates and the permitted uses listed in the careful, bureaucratic language of a post-war government agency that was just beginning to understand how important water records would become. Ruth looked at the documents for a long time. Then she made a phone call to a water rights attorney in Lincoln named David Park, who specialized in Nebraska water law and who had, over the previous decade, developed a particular expertise in the conflicts between agricultural water rights and commercial development projects that had become increasingly common as corporations discovered that eastern Nebraska's aquifer was one of the most reliable and accessible groundwater sources in the Midwest. David Park drove to Fremont 2 days later and sat with Ruth and Walter at Ruth's conference table and asked Walter questions for 3 hours. He asked about the creek intake system, when it was built, how it was permitted, what the permit terms were. He asked about the well, when it was drilled, who drilled it, what depth, what production rate, what the registration certificate said about permitted uses. He asked about Agricor Development's headwall, when it appeared, what Walter knew about their permits and approvals. Then David Park said something that Walter had not expected. He said, "Walter, your creek intake permit is probably not going to survive a legal challenge from Agricor. Nebraska water law for surface water is complex and commercial development has significant leverage in the permitting process. If they have the right approvals, and I suspect they do because they've done this before in other counties, they may have the legal right to reduce your surface water flow." Walter said nothing. David said, "But your well is a different matter entirely." He picked up the 1,948 registration certificate and looked at it carefully. He said, "This well was drilled in 1948 and registered with the state under the original Nebraska groundwater regulations. The permitted uses listed here include domestic, livestock, and agricultural irrigation. This registration predates Agricor's presence in this county by 53 years. It predates the permits they're operating under by 5 decades. Under Nebraska's prior appropriation doctrine for groundwater, earlier registration establishes priority. Your father's well has priority over every water use that Agricor has permitted in this area." Walter said, "But they didn't block the well. They blocked the creek intake." David said, "They blocked the creek intake because they didn't know about the well, or they knew about it and didn't believe it was functional, or they believed that cutting off your surface water supply would be sufficient pressure to make you sell without having to address the well at all." He paused. "But the well changes the legal picture significantly, because here is what the well registration tells me." He turned the certificate over and pointed to a section on the back that Walter had read many times but had never needed to think about carefully. "The registration," David said, "includes a clause that was standard in Nebraska, well, registrations from the 1940s through the 1960s. It says that the registered well owner has the right to draw water from the aquifer in amounts consistent with the permitted uses without interference from other water users whose permits postdate this registration. That means Agricor cannot legally operate their facility in a way that significantly draws down this aquifer without accounting for your prior registered rights. Walter said, "Their facility uses groundwater?" David said, "Their facility uses a combination of surface water and groundwater. The surface water is the creek system they've dammed. The groundwater is from a series of high-capacity wells they've drilled on the property they've assembled. Those wells are drawing from the same Platte River alluvial aquifer that your father's well draws from. And their permits for those wells were issued in 2000 and 2001. Your registration is from 1948. The room was quiet for a moment. David said, "They built a $50 million regional grain processing campus on water permits that are junior to a 1948 registration, sitting in a filing cabinet in a farmhouse in Dodge County. And they blocked your surface water intake without checking whether you had independent access to the aquifer they're depending on." Walter looked at the registration certificate in David Park's hands. He thought about Emil Preis in 1948, writing a check for $1,200 to a well driller from Fremont, registering the well with the state because that was the required and proper thing to do, keeping the certificate in a filing cabinet because important papers go in filing cabinets and you keep them there until you need them. He thought about what Emil had said. The well is yours. It goes into the ground we own. Nobody can take it from you. Emil had not known about Agricor Development LLC. He had not known about regional grain processing campuses or high-capacity commercial wells or the prior appropriation doctrine as it applied to conflicts between family farm registrations and corporate water permits. He had known that surface water can be interrupted and that a well drilled into reliable ground is a form of security that no neighbor and no change in circumstances upstream can affect. He had been right. He had been right in 1948 and he was right in 2001. And the certificate that proved it was in Ruth Hendricks's conference room in Fremont. David Park filed a formal notice of senior water rights with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources 2 weeks later. The notice cited the 1948 registration, documented Agricor's junior permits, and formally asserted that Walter Preis held prior rights to groundwater from the Platte River alluvial aquifer that took precedence over Agricor's commercial extraction permits. Agricor's legal team responded within a week. Their response was thorough and expensive and, according to David Park, somewhat desperate in its arguments, which was a sign that they understood the problem they had created for themselves. They argued that the 1948 registration was for domestic and livestock use only and did not constitute a prior right sufficient to constrain commercial extraction. They argued that the aquifer was sufficiently large that Walter's registered use and their commercial use were not in meaningful conflict. They argued that the relevant regulatory framework had changed sufficiently since 1948 that the original registration should be interpreted under modern standards. David Park's reply addressed each argument specifically and at length. The permitted uses on the 1948 certificate included agricultural irrigation, which under Nebraska law was not a domestic use and was entitled to full prior appropriation protection. The aquifer conflict was demonstrable through hydrological modeling that David had commissioned, which showed that Agricor's high-capacity wells would reduce available water to Walter's well measurably within 5 years of full operation. And the prior appropriation doctrine, which was constitutional in Nebraska, explicitly provided that earlier rights were not subject to reinterpretation under later regulatory frameworks. The Nebraska Department of Natural Resources took 8 months to issue its ruling. The ruling found in Walter's favor on the primary question of priority. It confirmed that the 1948 registration established senior rights to the aquifer that Agricor's 2000 and 2001 permits could not override. It required Agricor to modify their groundwater extraction plan to ensure that Walter's registered uses were not materially impaired. It also addressed the creek intake issue in a way that David Park had argued for but had not been certain the department would accept. The ruling found that AgriCorps' construction of the headwall and gate, which had completely eliminated Walter's surface water supply without prior notice or compensation, constituted an improper interference with an existing permitted water use and required AgriCorps to either restore Walter's surface water access or provide equivalent compensation. AgriCorps chose compensation. They offered Walter a settlement that included payment for the loss of surface water access, modification of their groundwater extraction plan, and a formal acknowledgement of Walter's senior water rights that would be recorded with the county and run with the land in perpetuity. Walter accepted the settlement. Not because he was satisfied with losing the creek intake that his father had built in 1961 and that he had used for 40 years, but because the settlement gave him what he needed: reliable water for his cattle and his farmstead, legal protection of his aquifer rights that was now on the permanent record, and enough in compensation to rebuild his water infrastructure on a system that didn't depend on surface water he couldn't control. He used part of the settlement money to run a new pipeline from Emil's well to updated livestock waterers throughout the cattle lot. He had the well inspected and the pump replaced with a modern unit. He had the casing tested and found it sound after 53 years. The well that Emil had drilled in 1948 for $1,200 was, in 2002, the most valuable piece of infrastructure on the Price farm, not because of what it produced in gallons per minute, but because of what it represented in terms of prior rights and legal standing. Walter kept farming until 2009, when his son Paul came back from Fremont permanently and took over the operation. Walter spent his retirement years in the farmhouse where he'd been born, doing the maintenance work he'd always done, keeping the well serviced, keeping the records current, keeping the registration certificate in the filing cabinet where Emil had put it in 1948. He added one document to the folder before he handed the farm over to Paul. He wrote a single page in his own handwriting, explaining the well's history, the 2001 legal dispute, and what the registration certificate meant and why it mattered. He described Emil's reasoning for drilling the well when he didn't urgently need it, the understanding that surface water could be interrupted and that something going into your own ground was a different kind of security. He described what David Park had told him about prior appropriation and senior rights, and what the 1948 certificate had meant in a courtroom context. He wrote at the bottom of the page, in the careful block printing that Emil had used and that Walter had learned from him, "Keep this certificate, keep it in this folder, keep it safe and keep it current. Someday, someone will try to take your water. When they do, this is what will stop them. Your great-grandfather understood that. Now you do too." Paul keeps the folder in the same filing cabinet. He has added his own records to it over the years: the annual water tests, the pump maintenance logs, the inspection reports. The well registration certificate from 1948 is at the front of the folder, where Walter put it after the settlement was signed, in a clear plastic sleeve that protects the paper without hiding anything on it. The cattle lot has modern waterers now, fed by a pipeline that runs directly from Emil's well. AgriCorps Development's regional grain processing campus operates 2 miles to the north. Their high-capacity wells draw from the same aquifer. The Platte River recharges it every year. The Price farm is still there. The water still comes up at 180 feet. And the document that proved it was there first, that established the right that no corporation's lawyers and no commercial development permit could override, is in a filing cabinet in a farmhouse in Dodge County, Nebraska, exactly where Emil Preis put it in 1948. Let me say something before we close that I think deserves to be said plainly. Emil Preis drilled a well he didn't urgently need, paid $1,200 for it in 1948. When $1,200 was not a small amount of money, registered it with the state because that was the right and required thing to do, and kept the certificate in a filing cabinet for 53 years. He did not do these things because he anticipated AgriCorps Development LLC. He did them because he understood that security is built in advance of the crisis, not in response to it. You cannot dig a well on the morning your water is cut off. You cannot register a water right after someone else has already established theirs. You cannot build a legal foundation when the legal battle has already begun. The men and women who built family farms that survived generation after generation did not survive by being lucky. They survived by being careful in the years when nothing seemed to be going wrong, by building redundancy into their systems when redundancy seemed unnecessary, by keeping records of what they owned and what they were entitled to in the full knowledge that someday someone would dispute it. Emil's $1,200 well was not an investment in the financial sense. It was an investment in the idea that a family's security should not depend entirely on circumstances outside their control. That wherever possible, the things you depend on should go into the ground you own, draw from sources that no neighbor can divert, and be registered in your name before anyone else establishes a competing claim. That is the whole lesson. Build it before you need it. Register it when you build it. Keep the certificate where it won't be lost. And trust that the careful work you do today will matter to people you will never meet, in situations you cannot imagine, in a future that will be shaped by the decisions you make right now. If this story stayed with you today, if it reminded you of something worth building before you need it, something worth registering, something worth keeping in a filing cabinet for as long as it takes, drop one word in the comments that describes Emil Preis. Just one word. Share this with someone who needs to hear that preparation is not pessimism. It is the deepest form of care you can show for the people who come after you. Subscribe if you haven't already. These are the stories that deserve to be told and remembered, and I want you here for every one of them.